questions that were posed to me, and I suppose the first one is relatively simple in terms of what we buy, and I do have a simple answer for that. Why we buy it and is our food actually our choice is more complicated, and I don't have the answer for that. If I did, I'd probably be in a different business, but I'm going to give us some insights. Okay, this is looking at the Irish grocery shoppers' spend related to the healthy eating guidelines. And terribly simply, as you know, they're depicted as a kind of a pyramid. And in fact, what we buy is quite different from the recommended. So that you could almost invert the pyramid. So the most recent piece of work that we in Safefood did on this was about what we called treat foods, which is sweets, drinks, biscuits and crisps, and looked at what the average weekly shop over 2017-2018 was, and we found that 19% of the average family supermarket shop, so that's not including forecourts or wherever, is spent on these foods, whereas only 7% is spent on vegetables. I don't think I need to say more. I suppose what's interesting there as well, because of course it's not just, dietitians will rightly tell you, and nutritionists, it's not just what you buy, it's what you actually eat. So, and I suppose a kind of a not surprising but an important finding there is that we totally underestimate our calorie intake in the same way as we tend to overestimate our height and maybe how much kind of interesting things we read. So this is just a little graph here which shows the difference on the left between what people reported in a very large survey that they ate in terms of their energy intake. The blue column is what they would actually have needed to eat to keep body and soul together. And on the right, the orange is what, when we did this piece of work with what's called double labeled water, which actually measures the throughput of energy, what they actually did eat in terms of their energy expenditure. So that's interesting. The last point as regards the question of that I'm addressing of what do we buy. What we buy and what we waste are different items in the sense of what we buy and what we eat. So you will not see very many Easter eggs in the rubbish bin, but you will see lots of vegetable waste. And just an interesting statistic, which I think actually came from Board Bio, was that there was a 7 times increase in the sale of Easter eggs this year over previous years. So just interesting. Now to the more vexed question, which is our food our choice? And well, the kind of right answer to that is that, you know, there are very many factors involved, and you know, you can divide them: emotional, social, educational, economic and environmental, but we're not here to do an exam answer. And I suppose I just wanted to share with you a few areas that are of particular interest to me, and I suppose with a particular health bent and biological and physical bent, given that that's my background. The first is our food values or norms. So the guy on the right here, I'm looking at a different screen, is wondering like where he will kind of whether he'll go to Deliveroo today, you know, and whether it'll be Indian or pizza or whatever else. So in other words, those norms have changed what's available. We've already spoken about the internet. We've spoken about protein, wherever it comes from or whatever. Another is the issue of cooking skills, and I'm not just talking about chopping onions, but you know, there are lots of apartments now without kitchens. Or kitchens without equipment, and you know, we're losing a lot of those skills. with the result that kind of people are looking at videos, making say a relatively simple recipe as though it was kind of they were working in a chemistry lab. So we have lost those skills, and that's an important issue. Then getting down to what certainly Rory spoke about, and that's this business of our appetite and our mood and how interrelated, and the more we know now about the science, I suppose, of appetite, hunger, satiety, and yes, a lot of work is being done in my adopted city about basically the bugs in the gut, the what's called the microbiota, and how they influence your mood, your behavior, your stress levels, but also how what we eat and our stress levels influence the gut flora. So our appetite is very much tied up in those type of biological areas. And as I say, the more we know about it, yes, there are certain things that we can consider doing in terms of probiotics and whatever, but the more we know about it, the scarier it is in ways, and yet it's illuminating. And this comes to another area, which is sleep. And, you know, even kind of medical colleagues of mine would have said, well, what has that really got to do with weight or with what we eat or whatever? But now, you know, the more we know once again about sleep, we know that as well as growth and development for children, it's really very much a time when there's a lot of hormonal activity going on. So a piece of research that we did maybe a year or so ago was about shift workers, and you know, we found that as you might expect, they're more likely to skip meals, much less likely to consume 5 or more portions of fruit and veg a day, and more likely to report alcohol abuse. And I suppose I was looking at a few of the tweets there, and they were about socioeconomic circumstances, and this was certainly very evident in this shift worker. You know, there are different types of shift work, whether we're talking about people who work in, say, healthcare, who are often relatively privileged, versus people who work in manufacturing, versus people who work in hospitality. And those in manufacturing, even though they actually had designated breaks and had better canteen facilities, in fact, their diet was still poorer than those who were in a more chaotic setup, and yet were able to manage better. So that was that. I put in Hugh, and you know, a number of the celebrity chefs now in particular have emphasised or made public, I suppose, what we've known for some time, which is the gut hormones and the effect of those, the effect of diet on those, and then the effect of those on what we consume. So, I mean, I have a photograph here of consumption of beer, and I suppose the point is, you know, I think we all know, or many of us know, that if you have a drink or maybe several drinks, you're more likely to eat, then you're even more likely to eat, and the types of foods that you eat the following morning, if that ever happened to anyone, is quite different, and your gut hormones have a lot to do with it. Then another issue, I suppose, is, you know, this issue of, oh, well, it's your genes or, you know, our genetic makeup, and there's absolutely no doubt about that. Our genes do influence considerably, even our preferences. However, we now know that we can turn genes on and off with diet and stress and physical activity. So it's called epigenetic change. So our genes are no longer completely our destiny. There's lots that we can do about it in terms of our appetite and whatever. And I suppose on that point, again, just to show you that we now have brain MRI evidence of the brain reward centres and the pleasure centres, showing that if we overconsume, and the one on the top right here is the MRI of a person with obesity, and you can see it's quite like the one on the diagonal opposite with very little red, showing that you need more and more stimulation and satiation if you have become, say, obese and are to some extent food or sugar addicted. Just our lifestyles, you know, things like what's available to us. We can see the difference between hamburgers then and now. Issues like where we get our food information from, whether it's kind of celebrities, fad diets, maybe misinformation about who's glucose intolerant and who isn't. Marketing, and this is my last point really, but it's about food marketing, and particularly as regards children are concerned. We know that it does promote lifetime priming in terms of children. An interesting piece of research that we did looked at 3-year-olds and then again at 5-year-olds, and the group of 3-year-olds, they were able to recognise about 60% of food brands, and by the time they were 5, they were able to recognise 80% of food brands. And those who were less privileged and had less good diets, and whose mothers and fathers were less educated, in fact, had better recognition, particularly of unhealthy brands. So I suppose, is our food really our choice? With more products, more challenges, and I think, as we mentioned already, it's the choice paradox. You know, it's not entirely our own choice at a conscious and logical level. Spock. Okay.
Thank you, Cliodhna.